Welcome to our annual adoption lecture. This follows on from our very successful conference series on adoption last year, entitled Reframing Adoption, and all of those recordings are on the ExChange website. This is a hybrid event, so we have over 100 people who've registered online, as well as the people in the room. For the people in the room, just a few housekeeping rules. We're not expecting a test of the fire alarm, so if it goes, we need to go down the corridor, turn right, and the fire exit's directly in front of you, and the toilets are just outside this room. So I'm really pleased to welcome Professor Laura Machin. We've had a lovely discussion this morning. She's come from Lancaster University, and she's going to talk about the Adopters Advocacy Project, highlighting really the needs and support required for adopters. After the lecture, there'll be the opportunity for questions, and we'll take them from the room. But if you're online, if you could put them in the chat, and then Dan will field those and we'll alternate. So welcome. We're so pleased to have you here, Laura, and
thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm genuinely flattered and to be invited. I spoke to my mum this morning, and she said to me, I said, "Oh Mum," I said, "I've just not got this presentation the way I want it." I said, "I don't feel it's right, it's not polished, so it's not in, I've been working on it for weeks." And she said, "Just be yourself." So I was like, okay, so I'm just going to be myself. So this is me. I was explaining to one person here, you're going to see me in all my mess as I'm working through it. It's very much a work in progress, but it was just such an opportunity to be here today and to share this data that I just couldn't turn it down. So bear with me. I want to thank Alison very much for inviting me. And Sean, I know, is not here, but I feel like a VIP. Sean has just taken care of me throughout, so I want to say a special thanks to Sean. I've even got a goodie bag, which is very generous to take back with me. So thank you, Sean, for that. Today I'm going to talk about adopters' mental health, and I'm going to share some of the things that adopters had the courage to share with me. And it is some of the things that people might find hard to hear. There are some things that they've definitely found hard to share. I was saying to Alison this morning, I feel like I've looked through somebody's letterbox, and I've just got a little snapshot of what's happening inside that household for these adopters. So I suppose I'm not really into kind of trigger warning, but just to sort of highlight to you and people also online, there are going to be conversations about child-to-parent violence or child-to-parent aggression or child-to-parent abuse. We are going to be talking, and some of them are quite graphic in detail, in description, and there is discussions around adoption disruption. So I just thought, I'm mindful who might be in the room, who might be listening as well, that if we get to those topics and they're just too much, I'm just sort of giving you advance notice. Might want to sort of step away for a bit. So today is the first time I'm sharing this data, and I'm hopefully I'm going to get some good feedback, some good comments, some good thought ideas for me to go away and read and to be inspired by from yourselves. I was saying to Chris on the way down, I'm used to working in a medical setting, so I'm used to starting off with a conversation going, so I'm non-clinical, and actually that doesn't necessarily apply here. So I just thought I'd say I'm a non-social worker, in case that is. I don't have a social work background. So if I'm very open to hearing any kind of what you might deem as very basic and fundamental, you share with me, because I'm not from that background. So thank you. So I'm a professor at Lancaster Uni, and I work in the Faculty of Health and Medicine. So my colleagues are typically clinical psychologists or medical doctors, as well as academic researchers. I'm a qualitative researcher, and I historically work on sensitive topics, and in particular I try to work with those that are seldomly heard populations, and try to use inclusive research techniques to sort of draw out and to hear their stories. I attend the All Party Parliamentary Group for Adoption and Permanence, and I am also an adopter and adoptee. Okay, so the Adopters Advocacy, that's a project we set up back in July 2023, and it really came about because from where we sat, there appeared to be a lack of research that focused solely on adopters' needs, prospective adopters and adopters' needs, particularly in the UK. Now, please don't, that is not to diminish any of the work that's gone before, of course. It was just more about when we were reading the articles, we always found that adopters naturally would then fall into talking about their children. You try to ask them a question about, how are you? And it always ended up talking about the children. And so we were wanting to try and sort of shift that narrative a little bit, and also to look at what adopters' needs and their support needs and how they're, from their perspective. We are trying to advocate for adopters, but through research. And our first project that we put out last September, we did the recruitment. We were able to recruit over 160 people to what we now have got an Adopters Advocacy Network, and that is a research network. That is people who have come forward in the UK who have agreed to hear about and are interested in participating in research around adopters' needs. We've got 2 projects on the go. We're working with clinical psychology trainees. Lacey's also doing one on mental health. Rhiannon's looking at the relationships in the household where there are birth children and adopted children. And Ellie is going on to be working with trialling creative methods and approaches. And one of the things she's going to be working on is doing digital storytelling, trying to explore adopters' decision making and trying to find ways that allow adopters to have their voice heard, their story told in a non-threatening ways, without having to relive what they've been already gone through. And one of the things we hope to come out of the project I'm going to tell you about next is this Letters to You series. So we asked adopters, what would you like X person to know about what adoption is like for you? Is that a social worker? Is it the head teacher? Is it the child? Is it your parents? So you could insert who it was. And so we're going to put together a Letters to You series and hopefully use them as part of training materials for GPs, health visitors, maybe for social workers, if there's anybody interested. So we are exploring those training opportunities and trying to link with social workers, both who are training social workers and also those who are already qualified. And then we're hoping to explore, we've had a lot of people come forward and volunteer their time. Particularly, we've had solicitors that have come forward to volunteer their time to support adopters advocacy, psychotherapists and ex-social workers who have been part of post-adoption support. And one of them is, one of those people is a medic as well, who works with looked after children doing their health checks. And she said that she's concerned about the people who are bringing in this case, the adopters, because the adoption order is still not been granted. So she's meeting the adopters and she's concerned about their mental health, in particular post-adoption depression. So we are exploring that health response, as we're describing it, to adopters' mental health. So that's what's going on and where we're heading. But today, and where we're in the thick of it right now, is we're working with our data from the Mental Health Project. So what do we know about adopters' mental health? And by no means is this a thorough, systematic literature review we've done. I'm just trying to find an overview here. So post-adoption depression, although it's not hormone related, it's still there with a persistent low mood occurring after a child has been placed, within a month the child has been placed. We know that the triggers of post-adoption depression is the adoption process and also the attachment issues that can come with it. We know that approximately 32% of UK adopters do become depressed, and there is talk around secondary trauma. And as a result of that secondary trauma, it can then make adopters vulnerable to compassion fatigue. Awareness of post-adoption depression has increased in recent years, and we see that now in some of the preparation and training and assessment of adopters. There is talk now about a post-adoption depression in part of that process. However, what's less well known is the potential for adopters to experience secondary trauma. The compassion fatigue, again, is talked about there. To our knowledge, there's no peer-reviewed studies that investigated the prevalence of compassion fatigue in adoptive parents. We do know, however, that 75% of foster carers experience compassion fatigue, but it is then poorly understood for adopters. We've looked at post-traumatic stress. We found that there was one study that used a qualitative approach to explore this post-traumatic stress in adoptive parents of traumatised adopted children. And we found one doctoral thesis showing that there was significantly high rates of secondary traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress amongst adoptive parents compared to the general population in the UK. This is all very limited though. I don't know whether you're able to see it from where you sit. Some of it's quite dated, or it's quite minimal. It's also done perhaps in other countries, not necessarily done in the UK, which of course then has an impact of how adoption is understood in those, and the process overseas, the support available, and also the culture around mental health. It's under-researched, I think it's fair to say, and there are terms, the literature is quite difficult to unpick because the terms are used interchangeably, and one of the examples we use is like compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress and burnout. They're used interchangeably in a lot of the literature that we've found. So it's quite hard to sort of unpick it all the time. Oh, sorry. So from where we sit, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma and post-traumatic stress is rarely discussed with prospective adopters during the adoption assessment process. And as a result, adopters lack awareness and insight into these mental health challenges. And those adopters that are experiencing some kind of challenges, some kind of mental distress, are really reluctant or scared to disclose their feelings with professionals, with their family and friends, out of shame or fear of disapproval. And as a result, there's very little dedicated therapeutic support for adopters and about their mental health. So with all that in mind, we decided to see if we could do an engagement study, really, just to get our first sense of what's out there with adopters, to see if they would even talk about their mental health with us. And I'm working with a wonderful person, Ellie, who's our researcher, and we wanted to see, the aims of our current project were to improve knowledge and awareness and understanding of adopters' mental health needs, to generate a better understanding of the existing support available to adopters when they're experiencing mental health and what support they would want to see in place. And a third strand of it, because this was our first venture into researching adopters and we didn't really know what the take, we never expected over 160 people to come forward. So that sort of blew us away a little bit. But at the time, we wanted to understand from adopters how they would want their stories shared, researched, explored. Although I'm not going to focus on that third aim in this presentation today. So we got ethics approval. We recruited adopters via our personal professional network, a parent community and online groups, and adoption agencies and organisations. And I'm particularly grateful there were some really brilliant adoption agencies and organisations who reached out to us, who really have helped us, and in particular we had a really positive response from Wales actually. So thank you, because it's made a real difference to us. Everybody that participated received a £25 gift voucher, even if they left the focus group early. We did 10 focus groups during October and December in 2023. And the focus groups have been recorded and have been transcribed, and we're just in the thick of it now, that thematic analysis. And you may appreciate, because the focus groups were 90 minutes up to 2 hours in length, they're lengthy. And so it's taken, and we're 10 of them, so there's quite a lot of analysis going on. We had 47 people participate, majority of them were women. Majority of them were identified as being white British. 5 of them had birth children and adopted children, and most of them had adopted more than one child. Most of them had adopted genetic siblings together as a sibling set, although some did have non-genetic siblings in the household. The vast majority had been approached to take on additional genetic siblings after the children had been placed. The majority of them were employed. We had head teachers, psychotherapists, psychiatrists, we had police, we had foster carers, I'm trying to think of everybody else. We had an awful lot of solicitors, academics. Those that were employed, some of them had become unemployed. They had left their job due to their children's needs, and were not in any other form of employment at that time. There was also a minority who were also homeschooling, had opted to homeschool for their children. It was fabulous in the range of experience and the consistency in the experiences. It did not seem to matter whether you had adopted in less than 12 months ago or whether you adopted 23 years ago. The people that came forward to speak to us, the stories and experiences were consistent. It didn't matter how long ago you'd adopted. The adopted child, people had babies under 12 months, and I think the oldest child that had been placed was 8 years of age. People had adopted through local authorities as well as the voluntary adoption agencies. We had some great solo adopters come forward, and we also had same-sex couples and heterosexual couples. Although I will admit, I must say that some of those people and couples, one partner had left the home, so the relationships were still intact. But it was there was a few adopters where a partner had left the home due to the dynamics in the household. Most had experienced a fertility treatment, although not everybody. Some had childhood insight of adoption and fostering, perhaps because their parents had fostered or they'd got an adopted sibling as they were growing up. And people had adopted children who were known prior to placement to have very complex needs. And then the vast majority after placement, their children had diagnoses of neurodiversity. We asked them about their mental health prior to adoption, during the adoption process, and then since the child had been placed. I did ask for specific examples when they felt their mental health had been particularly challenged, if they wanted to share that with us. We asked them about the support they'd accessed, and I did ask them about where they thought their support needs were, how they fitted with people who had given birth to their children. And then we also asked for their knowledge, adopters' knowledge and adopters' insight into adoption prior to becoming an adopter, what advice they would give to a prospective adopter now or to their past self. And I asked them about what their understanding was about post-adoption depression, etc. So when I asked adopters about their mental health, to describe their mental health, this is what many reported. It appeared to us that they were overwhelmed, they were exhausted mentally and physically, they were numb, they described themselves as numb, as shut down or shut off. Some described themselves as rarely speaking about their emotions, their feelings or thoughts, or they lacked the vocabulary to fully explain their feelings. During the workshops, we put up a diagram of some of the signs that you might be experiencing post-adoption depression or compassion fatigue or burnout. And I asked adopters, have you heard of these terms? Do you recognise any of these signs or symptoms in yourself? Do any of them relate to you? I think what's fascinating is that very few had heard of post-adoption depression, of compassion fatigue or secondary trauma, for example. I think that's perhaps because of the age of how long ago they had since they'd adopted, and those that had adopted most recently were more likely to say, oh yes, I have heard of it. But interestingly, when you ask people, have they heard of it, those that said they had heard of it, it was actually through a work context, a work setting, rather than necessarily from other adopters or from the training or preparation sessions they'd had. I then asked adopters, what have they done to support their mental health? What have they found useful? What would they need? If money was no object, if time was not a problem, what would you need to support your mental health? And this is some of the ones that we got back. Can I just check that the people online are seeing this screen as well? I don't have to read it out for them, I just want to check. Okay, thank you. So moving on to some of the themes that are coming out of the data, and this is some of the, I'm taking inspiration from. There's 3 themes that seem to be very interlinked. I'm struggling to sort of disconnect them and make them separate themes. They seem to all overlap. One of the theories that we've been playing around with is an othering theory. I noticed early on in the transcripts, there was this othering going on. Either the adopters were being othered, or adopters were othering others. Forgive me, I don't want to start going some kind of like rabbit hole, but hopefully it will come clearer as we get further on. So I just Googled Scholar, that it's kind of like othering theory. Does that even exist? And lo and behold, it does. Who knew? And othering is about non-belonging. Although there doesn't seem to be that much consensus on the content of othering from where I sit, from the little reading I've done so far. It seems to be that the literature is rooted in social psychology, so you might talk about the in-group and out-group. That might kind of sound quite common and quite familiar to us. But then there's also some literature that's based connected to post-colonial ideas, very much around this power critical discourse. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more. The idea that othering is this powerful process, it's beyond description, it's more than that. It's about knowledge structures, power relations, and this categorisation processes, and how these all interconnect and the effects that this then has. I want to be absolutely clear now when I talk about this, we are talking about othering within critical racism theory, and at no point am I starting making any comparisons to adopters' experiences to people who've experienced racism. That is not, I do not want to sort of get lost in that at all. I'm making it clearly, people who experience racism, it's not the same as what adopters are experiencing. I will, however, I do want to take inspiration from that. I want to see what that lens would look like if I use that to understand my data. And some of the things that come out of this critical racism theory is microaggressions and micro-invalidations. And this came about in the 1970s. Most of the authors I've read on this have been based in America, in the States, so I'm open to hearing more from other countries if it's different. But working on these definitions, these ideas, I wanted to see what it would look like if I applied a micro-invalidation or a microaggression to the data. And from where I sit, it's really apparent. When adopters talked about the lack of support available for adopters and the blame they felt, the blame being apportioned to them. Adopters felt very devalued. They felt there was an inherent hierarchy, that adopters didn't matter, that you're unimportant, compared to the other stakeholders in the adoption process. Adopters didn't feature. At times, and I think these are the ones that I found most moving, were when there was a complete denial of adopters' needs. The upside is I also got a sense of the very dry and slightly warped sense of humour that adopters appear to have developed, perhaps over the years. This person, adopter 18, this person was both laughing and crying at the same time. And in turn, the vast majority of people during that workshop were laughing and crying with this person as well. And I should say that the adopters that participated did come from all 4 nations. This is not just England-centric. I was saying to Alison, it's really challenged my researcher abilities to try and build rapport and to stand with somebody when you're doing a workshop online. And I also definitely experienced a few bad nights following the workshops. I was definitely still having lots of things going around in my head. Hopefully you're beginning to get a sense of that looking through the letterbox and or peeping behind around the door. I feel like people have been very courageous to share an awful lot with me and Ellie, and in front of other adopters. I feel they've been very courageous to do so. The other element that came out very clearly, and there's quite a sense of anger that came with this aspect of it, was this silence around the realities of adoption. And this came out in sort of 2 ways. When people talked about the adoption preparation, the training, the assessment process, the lack of honesty and openness and transparency about what adoption could be like. And then it also came about when people were talking about their individual child and the matching part and the questions they asked in order to understand the child that they were going to be adopting. Some of the debates within the othering theory that I'm trying to grapple with is the idea whether there's a positive outcome to being othered. So part of the debate is actually there's a benefit that comes from being othered. This idea of coalition building, this consciousness raising, this coming together, this idea of being part of something in order to make a difference. And so in turn, you start othering others. You start saying, you're not an adopter, you have no clue what it's like. And it's like, is that a positive? Do you find your tribe? As I've since got up to speed now, Ellie's been getting me up to speed and moving me into the 21st century now about having a tribe. And so is it a positive thing? And so some of the debate is actually, it's okay to be othered because there's good things that come out of it. So this is some of the quotes that we asked people. Why did you sign up to the workshop? Why have you signed up to Adopters Advocacy? What made you join? And these are some of the responses we got. because it is a debate around the positive outcomes of being othered, there are others who say, other academics who say, the other side of the debate is saying, actually, there's not a positive outcome to being othered. There's nothing positive about being othered. And actually, what you're witnessing is a different response to being othered. And I thought, okay, yes, actually, it doesn't always seem very positive when adopters are talking about that discussion with with social workers or with other parents or even with employers, family. It doesn't always sound that positive. There's not always this coming together and finding your tribe and this coalition forming. Actually, sometimes simply being othered and people not getting it is just downright hard. And because I am into the ethics of what we do, of all policy and practice, I started finding I read this article about the role of social workers, in adoption, and then this idea of ethical trespass came up. And I thought, oh gosh, that's an interesting angle. What is it? I'd not heard of ethical trespass before, despite me teaching on medical ethics. I was like, oh, I've not heard of this. So I thought I'd just read a bit more about it. And I found that it seems to sort of overlap with this othering idea still. And it made me think about social workers in particular, those that are in charge, who are in a position of power perhaps, or influence perhaps, who can then determine what is normal and non-normal and what is healthy and unhealthy. And these are some of the quotes that came out when I thought about ethical trespass. It's not intentional. It's not coming from a bad place. It is the unintentional, simply because you're part of the process. But also you're in such a position of influence. What can you do with that to help adopters? And that sort of slightly shifted the narrative for me. The idea of me looking at social workers in a different perspective, a different position. And people, the adopters that we spoke to, were saying, actually, yes, we're not coping, but actually it'd be weird if we were coping. Or, yes, we are coping, we still need some support, but it'd be normal if we couldn't have, it would be abnormal if we didn't have that support. And it's this idea of who's determining what's normal and what's deemed as needing support. And they kept coming back to social services, the system, social workers, the process. And I think this is the one element that I think is perhaps the most trickiest for adopters. Because the people that we spoke to, the 47 people we spoke to, it was absolutely apparent that they get up every day and care for their children, regardless of what's thrown at them. And so at no point were any of these 47 adopters stating that they were more important than their child. They were not saying that at all. What they were saying was, is there only room for one person in this relationship to have needs? This child-first rhetoric, this child-first discourse. You're never going to find an adopter, in my personal opinion, not my professional, you're never going to find an adopter to say that they matter more than the child. But you are getting some adopters coming to us and saying, actually, we do have needs. And I think it's okay that we've got some needs, we just need them met. And then the third thing we've been looking at and reading about is psychological safety. The psychological safety, so we've gone from critical racism theory, we've now gone to ethical trespass, and now we're in organisational behaviour and social psychology. Completely different. So far out of my comfort zone. The idea of psychological safety is it's about people's perceptions of the consequences of taking interpersonal risks, making people feel secure and capable of changing their behaviour in response to challenges. Well, by God, that sounds like adopters. That sounds what adopters need, psychological safety, so they can feel secure and capable of making change when they're faced with challenges. And their relationships within that given group are characterised by trust and respect. It got me thinking about where adopters fit in that relationship. We talk about the team around the child, and I wondered if adopters could be viewed as as part of that team around a child. Now, this is taken from Dr. Hayley Lewis, and she has put this together based on Timothy Clark's new book about psychological safety. So I can't take any credit for it. That is Dr. Hayley Lewis's work, thinking. It made me wonder about when I looked at those boxes right at the bottom. Could we tick and say, do adopters feel accepted for who they are? Do they believe they matter? Do they feel safe during all parts of that adoption process? Can they make mistakes and give feedback? I think it's possible for all elements of all the 4 stages to apply to adopters and genuinely question, are we social workers, or is the system creating psychological safety where there's respect and permission to disagree, where there isn't pressure to conform? So I'm coming to the end, and these are emerging conclusions. They're me trying to pull together the strands and the threads to find some kind of narrative. I think it's fair to say, from the data I've shared with you, that adopters feel devalued, worthless and powerless, certainly the adopters that spoke with us. That they find their feelings and needs denied and silenced by those in positions of power. I want to be absolutely clear, the purpose of Adopters Advocacy and the projects we have and will engage in, it's not about social worker bashing, that's not the intention. This is about trying to bring about positive change and making a difference. And that was the tone throughout the workshops. It was not about social worker bashing. Adopters do consider themselves lied to duped, tricked and pressurised. But they want change. They want to see change in the adoption process, in that social worker relationship. They are deserving of therapeutic support for themselves, which is independent of adoption agencies. The child first, as we're describing it for the moment, is actually suppressing adopters' abilities to have needs. Again, just to be absolutely clear, it's not about prioritising adopters over any other stakeholder in that adoption process. But it is possible to have secondary needs rather than just having no needs. Framing adopters' needs as self-care, as well-being and resilience is actually denying adopters have mental health needs and is placing the ownership on adopters to find the solution. The lack of discussion on compassion fatigue, etc., means adopters feel it is only them that are facing challenges and are actually left questioning what is wrong with themselves. And I think it would be interesting to look at what we can learn from others who are experiencing similar mental health challenges and how they have been overcome and approached. And sadly, COVID, I think, has really brought to the fore, that we are having to be creative. The NHS is having to be creative about how they're taking care of their doctors and nurses, for example, who are now experiencing compassion fatigue when they worked on the front line. I think there's some brilliant studies coming out now with medics and nurses who worked in ICU and A&E, and the mental distress that they're experiencing and how that is now being approached within the NHS. Social workers are in a really powerful position to determine what is health and illness, what is normal and dysfunctional. Social workers can shift the culture around adopters' support needs and actually advocate for adopters to protect them, to retain and attract adopters. Social workers can normalise adopters facing mental health challenges by talking about it and being open about it. They can demand the support for adopters' mental health, and they can shift their perceptions of adopters as part of a caring team around a child. So on behalf of the adopters, I'd like to say thank you very much for coming to listen. They wanted their stories told and you have heard, so thank you. Please do keep in touch. I'm really open to learning from yourselves, so please do keep in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.